The cage door sealed shut with a hiss, and I did not flinch. That was the first mistake they made. Not the ceiling, not the chains, not the cold metal room they called a containment suite. Their first mistake was watching my face and reading nothing there but fear, when what I felt was something closer to patience. My name is Kira Voss, and I am 19 years old. I was born on a world the star charts call Charon 9, though nobody who lives there calls it that. We call it home. The rest of the galaxy calls it a Deathworld, a place too harsh, too violent, too hungry to ever raise something as soft as a human being. They are wrong about that. They have always been wrong about that. 3 of them stood outside my cage, tall and pale-skinned, with elongated fingers and eyes that never seemed to blink all the way. Their leader, a broad-shouldered being named Dorian Vask, leaned close to the transparent wall separating us and spoke in a voice dripping with something he must have thought was kindness. "You are safe now," he said. "We have taken you from that terrible place. No more storms, no more monsters, no more starving in the dark." I looked at him and said nothing. What was there to say? He believed he was rescuing me. He believed the planet I loved was a prison, and that his ship, with its humming engines and sterile white halls, was salvation. He could not have been more wrong if he had tried. I let my shoulders slump. I let my eyes go wide and glassy, the way a frightened animal's might. It cost me nothing to give him what he expected to see. On Charon 9, we learn early that the greatest weapon is not strength. It is patience, wrapped inside misdirection. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away with his crew trailing behind him, murmuring about how broken I must be, how long the recovery would take, how gentle they would need to be with me. I listened to their footsteps fade down the corridor, and only then did I let my true expression return, calm and steady, my mind already working. I had been on this ship for 6 hours. In that time, I had counted 11 guards on rotation, memorized the rhythm of the shift changes, and noticed that the door mechanism outside my cage used a magnetic lock instead of a mechanical one. Magnetic locks fail during power fluctuations. Power fluctuations were something I could create. They had scanned me when I was brought aboard, of course. They found no weapons because I carried none. Where I come from, you do not need weapons if you understand the world around you well enough. A drop of static electricity built up through friction against the fabric of my sleeve was enough to make the sensor by the door flicker for half a second. Half a second was enough time to see how the wiring beneath the panel was routed. I spent the rest of that first day appearing exactly as broken as they wanted me to be. I ate the strange, tasteless food they gave me. I flinched when the guards passed. I let tears fall when a woman with silver hair, who introduced herself as a caretaker named Mira Solt, sat outside my cage and spoke softly about the horrors she assumed I had endured. "You do not have to be afraid anymore," Mira told me, her voice gentle, almost musical. "We know what that world does to children. We have seen the reports. The storms alone kill thousands each year. The predators, the toxic soil, the endless winters. It is a miracle you survived it all." I thought about telling her the truth. I thought about explaining that the storms she feared were something we tracked for sport, that the predators she pitied me for facing were animals my mother taught me to respect rather than fear, that the soil she called toxic simply meant we grew our food differently than she expected. I thought about telling her that surviving Charon 9 was not a miracle. It was simply what we did, every day, the way she might breathe or blink. Instead, I nodded and let another tear fall, because the truth would come soon enough, and there was no reason to spend it early. That night, if a ship traveling through the endless dark can be said to have a night, I lay on the thin cot they had given me and thought about my mother. She had died 2 years earlier, taken not by a storm or a beast, but by a lung sickness that no medicine on our world could cure. Even so, in her final months, she had continued teaching me, because that was what she believed mattered most. "Fear is only information," she used to say, her voice rough from the illness that was slowly stealing her breath. "It tells you that something is dangerous." Once you understand why it is dangerous, you no longer need the fear. You only need the plan. I held on to those words as I lay in that cage, surrounded by beings who believed they had saved me from a monster, when in truth, they had simply brought a different kind of monster onto their ship without realizing it. The next morning, a new figure came to observe me. He was leaner than Vask, with sharp eyes that studied me the way a merchant studies goods before a sale. He introduced himself as Cade Rourke, and I understood immediately, from the way the other crew members straightened when he passed, that he held some rank above them. "She looks stronger than the last one," Cade said to Mira, as though I could not hear him, or perhaps he simply did not care if I did. The Deathworld ones usually do. Bones are denser, muscle is thicker. Command wants her evaluated for the labor program once she has been broken in properly. Broken in. I turned the phrase over in my mind and felt something cold settle beneath my ribs. Not fear, but a decision hardening into place. I had let them believe I was harmless because it served me to let them believe that. But there is a difference between waiting and surrendering, and I had no intention of doing the second. That afternoon, while a guard named Odell Finch made his rounds, I performed my first real test. I waited until he stood directly in front of my cage, checking a data pad in his hand, distracted and unaware. I reached out slowly, as though simply stretching stiff limbs after long hours of confinement, and let my fingers brush against the edge of the doorframe where the wiring ran beneath a thin metal seam. It took less than 2 seconds. I felt the faint vibration of current running through the frame, understood instantly how the locking mechanism drew its power, and withdrew my hand before Odell even looked up. He never noticed. Why would he? To him, I was simply a frightened girl reaching toward the only source of comfort available in a cold room, the wall itself. But I now understood something valuable. If I could disrupt the power flow to this section for even a few seconds, the magnetic lock would fail open. The rest would be a matter of timing and patience, 2 things Quran 9 had taught me better than any other world could have. I spent the following day continuing my performance. I ate little. I spoke less. I let the crew whisper among themselves about how deeply traumatized I must be, how long it would take to make me useful for whatever labor program awaited me. Mira brought me warm broth and spoke kindly, believing she was comforting a broken child. Cade observed me with the calculating eyes of someone measuring a tool for its future use. Vask checked on me twice, always with that same false warmth, always certain that he understood exactly what kind of creature he had captured. None of them understood anything at all. On the 3rd night, I made my first move, though to any observer it would have looked like nothing more than an accident. I complained, through gestures and a few broken words I pretended to struggle with, that the air in my cage felt stale, that I could not breathe properly. Mira, sympathetic as always, adjusted a small ventilation panel near the base of my cell wall to increase airflow, exactly as I had hoped she would. That panel, I had already determined, sat directly above a junction box feeding power to 3 sections of the ship, including the corridor outside my cage and, more importantly, a maintenance duct system that ran beneath the crew quarters. Once Mira left, satisfied that she had eased my discomfort, I waited until the corridor lights dimmed for what the crew called their rest cycle, and then I acted. Using a thin strip of metal I had quietly worked loose from the frame of my cot over the previous 2 nights, careful to leave no visible gap, I reached through the ventilation panel and touched it against 2 exposed contacts inside the junction box. A spark, small and quiet, jumped between them. The lights in the corridor flickered once, twice, and the magnetic seal on my cage door released with a soft click that sounded, to my ears, louder than any alarm. I did not run. Running is what a frightened animal does, and frightened animals are easy to catch. Instead, I stepped out slowly, listening, cataloging. 2 guards stationed at the far end of the corridor had turned toward the flickering lights, confused, murmuring to each other about a power fault. Neither had noticed the cage door was open. I had perhaps 90 seconds before someone thought to check on me directly. 90 seconds is an eternity when you know exactly what you are doing with them. I moved to the small maintenance hatch I had spotted 3 days earlier, tucked low in the wall beside my cage, disguised as a simple access panel for cleaning equipment. My fingers found the release catch instantly, the same design I had studied through the ventilation grate. The hatch opened without a sound, and I slipped inside, pulling it closed behind me just as I heard footsteps approaching from the corridor. Crouched in the narrow duct, surrounded by humming machinery and the low vibration of the ship's systems, I allowed myself a single breath of something that was not quite relief, because relief implied the danger had passed, and I understood clearly that it had not. It had only just begun. Somewhere above me, I heard Vask's voice rise in alarm, calling for a head count, demanding to know how a single, unarmed girl could have vanished from a sealed containment cell without triggering a single alarm. I smiled slightly in the darkness, because I already knew the answer, even if he did not. They had brought me aboard believing they understood exactly what a Deathworld girl was: a survivor, a victim, someone to be pitied, rescued, and eventually put to use. What none of them understood, not Vask with his false kindness, not Mira with her gentle sympathy, not Cade with his calculating eyes, was that survival on Charon 9 was never about enduring hardship and hoping it would end. It was about learning every weakness in the thing trying to kill you, waiting until the perfect moment, and then making certain it never got the chance to try again. Somewhere behind me, alarms began to sound, distant and muffled through the duct walls, and I began to move deeper into the ship, unhurried, unafraid, already 3 steps ahead of every single one of them. The hunt, as they would soon come to call it, had only just begun. They believed they were hunting a frightened girl who had slipped her cage in a moment of desperate panic. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. The ship, I learned within the first hour of moving through its ducts, was called the Ashen Verge, a name I found strangely fitting for a vessel about to become the setting of the biggest mistake its crew would ever make. I moved through the narrow maintenance channels with slow, deliberate care, feeling the vibration of the engines through the metal beneath my palms, listening to distant voices carried through the ductwork like whispers traveling down a long hallway. Vask's voice came through clearest, sharp with irritation and something close to disbelief. "She is a child," he said to someone, likely Cade, though I could not see them. "Untrained, unarmed, terrified. She cannot have gone far. Seal every deck, post guards at every junction, and find her before she hurts herself wandering into an unshielded section." I nearly laughed at that. Hurts herself. As though I were fragile glass, instead of something built by a world that tested every single person born onto it before their first birthday even arrived. I kept moving instead, tracing the duct system toward what I had already identified, through careful listening during my 3 days in the cage, as the ship's primary environmental control room. Every vessel, no matter how advanced, depends on systems that regulate air, temperature, gravity, and pressure. On Charon 9, we grow up understanding environment as a living thing, something that can be read, predicted, and in the right circumstances, turned against whatever threatens you. A storm is not simply weather. It is a weapon, if you understand its patterns well enough to stand in the right place at the right moment, while everything around you is swept away. This ship's environment was no different. It was simply smaller, and far more fragile than any storm I had ever faced. I reached a junction where the duct split into 3 paths, and I paused, listening. Footsteps echoed below me, heavy and hurried, at least 4 guards moving in formation through the corridor beneath the grating. I pressed myself flat against the duct wall and waited, counting seconds, until their footsteps faded into the distance. That was when I noticed the first true clue about how poorly this crew understood the nature of the girl they were hunting. One of the guards, a broad figure I recognized from earlier as a tracker named Isolde Marsh, stopped directly beneath the grating and spoke into a communicator. "No sign of her in Section 4, Isolde reported. "She's probably curled up somewhere crying. These Deathworlders always fall apart once the adrenaline wears off. I've seen it before." I filed that comment away carefully, the same way I filed every mistake they made. They believed fear was the only fuel a person could run on, that once fear faded, collapse would follow. They did not understand that on Quran 9, fear was never the fuel. Understanding was the fuel, and understanding does not fade. It only grows sharper with time. I continued moving until I reached the environmental control room, accessed through a service grate above a bank of humming machinery. Dropping down silently, I found myself in a narrow chamber lined with control panels, each one labeled in a script I could not read, though the icons beside the labels told me enough. Gravity regulation, atmospheric composition, temperature control, waste reclamation. I smiled at the sight of it, the same quiet, focused smile my mother used to give when she found the perfect vantage point during a hunt. This was not a room full of unfamiliar alien technology. This was simply the ship's version of weather, arranged neatly into panels I could learn to read within hours. I spent that time studying the controls, careful never to alter anything that would trigger an immediate alarm. I traced wiring paths, noted which systems connected to which sections, and slowly built a map inside my mind of exactly how this vessel breathed, moved, and lived. Gravity plating beneath the crew quarters could be adjusted independently from the plating in cargo bays. Oxygen levels could be shifted section by section for what I assumed were emergency containment purposes. Temperature controls ran through a separate but connected network that, if manipulated carefully, could affect nearly every deck at once. By the time alarms began sounding through the corridors outside, signaling that the crew had finally organized a proper search grid, I already understood more about this ship than most of its own crew did. I heard Cade's voice again, closer this time, speaking with a guard just outside the environmental room's outer door. "She has been gone 4 hours, Cade said, tension edging into his tone. "That is longer than any previous specimen has managed to evade capture. I want thermal scans run through every duct on this deck, immediately." Thermal scans. That was useful information, and dangerous information, both at once. If they could track my body heat through the ship's systems, hiding would soon become far more difficult than it had been. I needed to move quickly, and more importantly, I needed to make sure that whatever they found when they scanned for heat led them somewhere other than where I actually was. I left the environmental room through a different service hatch, careful to avoid the corridor where the guard and Cade still stood talking. As I moved, an idea began forming, one built on a lesson my mother taught me during a hunting trip when I was perhaps 12 years old, tracking a pack of what we called ridge wolves through a canyon during a heat storm. Predators trust their tools more than their instincts, she had told me then, crouched beside me in the shadow of a rock formation while 3 ridge wolves passed close enough to touch. Give them false information through the tool, and they will follow it blindly, long after their instincts would have warned them otherwise. If the crew of the Ashen Verge trusted thermal scans to track me, then I needed to give their scanners something to track that was not actually me. I found what I needed 2 decks down, in a section the crew used for storage, filled with crates of supplies and, more usefully, several pieces of machinery that generated low levels of heat during operation. Working quickly and quietly, I rerouted a small heating element from a damaged piece of equipment, wired it loosely into a maintenance duct running parallel to the one I had been using, and set it to cycle heat in a pattern that would mimic the movement of a person walking slowly through the ship. It was crude. It would not fool a careful inspection. But it did not need to fool a careful inspection. It only needed to fool a search team already convinced they were chasing a frightened, exhausted girl running out of options. I retreated to a maintenance space 3 decks away and waited, listening through the ship's vents as the search teams converged on the false heat signature I had created. Voices grew excited, then confused, then frustrated as they searched an empty section and found nothing but a strange heat trace with no source they could identify. "It has to be her," I heard Yisolde insist. "The signature matches human body heat almost exactly." "Almost," Cade replied, his voice tight with growing suspicion. "Almost is not the same as exactly." I noted the caution in his voice, and understood, with a small flicker of respect I had not expected to feel, that Cade Rourke was not a fool. He was beginning to suspect that something about this hunt did not match his expectations. That suspicion would make him more dangerous than the others, and more useful to me, if I could learn to read his decisions before he made them. Over the following hours, I moved through the ship methodically, gathering information the way another person might gather supplies. I learned the layout of 3 additional decks. I discovered a secondary control junction that governed lighting throughout the lower half of the vessel. I found, tucked away in a rarely used storage bay, a stockpile of tools that the crew used for hull repairs, tools that could easily be repurposed for far more immediate needs, though I resisted using any of them yet. Every action I took needed to serve a purpose beyond simple survival. I was not merely trying to avoid capture. I was building toward something larger, though even I did not yet know exactly what shape that something would take. By the time the ship's artificial night cycle began, the search teams had grown tired and frustrated, their voices carrying less confidence with each passing hour. Vask's tone, when he finally spoke again over the ship's internal communication system, had lost its earlier warmth entirely. "This is no longer acceptable," he announced to the crew, his voice echoing through every corridor. "A single untrained girl has evaded capture for nearly 10 hours aboard a fully staffed vessel. I want the tracker teams briefed and ready by the next cycle. If she cannot be found through standard search methods, we will bring in specialists who know exactly how to handle difficult specimens." Specialists. I turned that word over carefully as I crouched in a shadowed alcove near the ship's lower cargo bay, watching a patrol pass by without noticing me at all. Whatever specialists Vask intended to bring in, I understood they would be far more dangerous than the guards and trackers I had encountered so far. I would need to prepare for them differently, not by hiding better, but by understanding exactly how they hunted, so that I could turn their own methods back against them, the same way I had already begun turning this entire ship's systems into tools I could use. I thought again of my mother, of long nights spent tracking predators far larger and faster than I was, learning that the difference between prey and hunter was never about size or strength. It was about who understood the terrain better, who could read the signs left behind by fear and confusion, and who was willing to wait patiently for the exact right moment to act. This ship, with its corridors and vents and hidden systems, was simply a different kind of terrain. I intended to understand it completely before this hunt ended, and I intended to make certain that when it did end, it would not end the way any of them expected. Somewhere above me, alarms continued to sound intermittently. Search teams moved through decks I had already studied and abandoned, and Cade Rourke's growing suspicion sat like a small ember in the back of my mind, a detail I would need to address carefully in the hours ahead. For now, I settled deeper into the shadows of the cargo bay, allowed myself a slow, controlled breath, and began planning my next move, fully aware that the true difficulty of this hunt had not yet even begun. The specialists arrived through a docking bay on the ship's upper deck roughly 6 hours later, and I watched their approach through a narrow observation grate I had discovered while mapping the ventilation network above the hangar. There were 4 of them, moving with a discipline the regular crew lacked entirely, their equipment sleek and purposeful rather than standard issue. I recognized immediately that these were not ordinary guards sent to search corridors. These were hunters, trained specifically for the purpose of tracking creatures who did not want to be found. Cade Rourke greeted them personally, his posture stiff with something between relief and wounded pride, as though bringing in outside help felt like an admission of failure he resented having to make. "She has evaded 3 search teams and disabled a section of thermal scanning equipment," Cade told them, his voice carrying clearly up through the vent. "I do not believe she is simply frightened anymore. I believe she is deliberately misleading us." The lead specialist, a tall figure with mechanical enhancements visible along both forearms, studied Cade for a long moment before responding. "Deathworld specimens sometimes exhibit heightened survival instincts," she said, her tone clinical, almost bored. It is a known behavioral pattern. Fear responses can mimic strategic thinking in certain high-stress environments. Do not mistake instinct for intelligence. I felt something settle in my chest at those words, not anger, though I understood anger would have been the expected response. What I felt instead was closer to clarity. This was the core mistake every single one of them had made from the moment I stepped aboard this ship, and it was a mistake so deeply rooted in their assumptions that even their most trained specialists could not see past it. They believed intelligence and instinct were opposites, that a creature acting instinctively could not also be acting with genuine understanding and purpose. On Quran 9, we learned early that the two were never separate. Instinct, sharpened by generations of survival, become indistinguishable from intelligence, because both existed for exactly the same reason, to keep you alive long enough to see tomorrow. I retreated from the observation grate and moved deeper into the ship's ventilation network, already reconsidering my approach. If these specialists intended to hunt me using instinct-based tracking methods rather than pure technology, then I would need to think differently than I had with the previous search teams. I would need to make my environment work against instinct itself. Over the following hours, I began preparing the ship the way my mother once prepared our home during storm season, layer by layer, trap by trap, until the entire structure became an extension of my own intentions. The first area I focused on was a long corridor connecting the crew quarters to the ship's central hub, a section I had already identified as a likely route the specialists would use during their search, given its position relative to the cargo bay where I had last triggered a false heat signature. Using my knowledge of the environmental control room, I adjusted the gravity plating beneath that specific corridor section by a small, almost unnoticeable amount, just enough to shift the effective gravity from whatever standard the ship normally maintained to something closer to Charon 9's natural pull. To me, that shift would feel like nothing at all. My body had been shaped since birth by gravity, nearly half again as strong as whatever these specialists were accustomed to. To them, however, even a modest increase would translate into slower movements, heavier limbs, and a body working against forces it had never been trained to handle. I did not activate the change immediately. Instead, I waited, watching through strategically placed observation points I had mapped over the previous hours, until I confirmed that the specialists had indeed begun moving through that corridor in their search pattern, exactly as I predicted they would. Only then did I trigger the gravity shift, remotely, through a small control relay I had rigged earlier from a junction box 3 decks away. The change came gradually, over the course of nearly a minute, subtle enough that none of them immediately recognized what was happening. I watched through the grate as their movements slowed almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably, their normally fluid strides becoming heavier, more deliberate. "Something feels wrong," one of the specialists said, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "My legs feel heavier than they should." The lead specialist paused, running a hand along the corridor wall as though checking for some kind of malfunction. "Environmental fluctuation," she said finally, "likely a side effect of the earlier power disruption. Continue the search." I allowed myself a small, satisfied breath at that response. She had correctly identified that something had changed, but she had misattributed the cause entirely, believing it to be an unintended consequence of my earlier actions, rather than a deliberate trap I had built specifically for this moment. That misunderstanding was exactly what I needed. I continued monitoring their progress as they pushed forward through the corridor, their pace slowing further with each passing minute as the gravity continued its gradual increase. By the time they reached the midpoint of the passage, I estimated the local gravity had climbed to nearly Charon 9 levels, a shift that would have been completely unremarkable to me, but which now left all 4 specialists moving with visible effort, their breathing growing heavier, their earlier confidence replaced by a creeping unease none of them could quite explain. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not to attack them, not directly, because I had no intention of causing harm I did not need to cause. My goal was simpler, and, in its own way, far more effective. I needed them to understand, on some instinctive level, even if their conscious minds refused to accept it, that this ship was no longer entirely their territory. I used a secondary relay to seal both ends of the corridor simultaneously, isolating the specialists within the section I had already modified. Alarms began sounding immediately, and I heard their voices rise in confusion and irritation as they realized they were trapped. "The doors have locked," one of them called out. "This has to be her doing." "Impossible," another replied, though the confidence in his voice had noticeably faded. "She is untrained. She has no access to ship systems." I smiled at that from my hidden position within the ventilation network above them, because in that single sentence he had summarized the entire misunderstanding that had defined this hunt from its very first moment. They believed access required training, that understanding a system required years of technical education rather than simple, patient observation. They had never considered that a person raised on a world where every mistake could mean death might develop an entirely different kind of expertise, one built not on formal instruction, but on the constant, unforgiving necessity of reading one's surroundings correctly the first time, every time. I allowed the specialists to remain sealed within the corridor for exactly 11 minutes, long enough for the heightened gravity to leave all 4 of them visibly exhausted, their earlier discipline replaced by frustrated confusion, but not so long that any of them faced genuine danger. This was not about causing harm, it was about demonstrating, clearly and unmistakably, exactly what kind of mistake they had made in assuming I was simply a frightened girl running blindly through unfamiliar corridors. When I finally released the gravity shift and unsealed the corridor doors, the specialists stumbled forward into the ship's central hub, breathing heavily, their mechanical enhancements doing little to disguise how thoroughly the experience had rattled them. Cade Rourke met them there, his expression shifting from concern to something far more troubled as he took in their exhausted state. "What happened?" he demanded. The lead specialist straightened slowly, forcing her breathing back under control before answering. "The gravity in that corridor increased significantly," she said. "And then the doors sealed on both ends simultaneously. This was not a malfunction. This was deliberate." Cade's expression darkened further. "She did this?" "If she did," the specialist replied carefully, "then whatever assumptions we made about her capabilities were incorrect." I watched this exchange from my hidden vantage point with something close to quiet satisfaction, though I understood the situation had grown more serious now. Cade Rourke, whose suspicion I had already noted as more dangerous than the others, would no longer dismiss my actions as panic or luck. He would begin looking for patterns, for intention, for the kind of deliberate planning that had, until this point, remained hidden behind their assumption that I was simply an unfortunate victim running for her life. That was a problem, but it was also an opportunity. If Cade began thinking of me as a genuine strategic threat rather than a frightened captive, then his decisions would become more predictable in their own way, driven by caution and fear of further embarrassment rather than the confident dismissiveness that had defined the crew's approach so far. Predictable decisions, whether born from confidence or fear, were something I could work with. Over the following hours, I continued adjusting my approach, moving through sections of the ship the specialists had not yet searched, while carefully avoiding areas where they concentrated their efforts. I disabled 2 additional thermal sensors using small, precise disruptions I had learned from studying the environmental control panels, and I rerouted a section of the ship's internal communication network so that certain messages between search teams experienced brief but confusing delays, just enough to create small gaps in their coordination without revealing the cause. During one of these movements, I found myself pausing near a small maintenance alcove close to what I had identified as the ship's primary computing core, the artificial intelligence system responsible for managing much of the vessel's automated functions. I had avoided this area during my earlier exploration, uncertain of how heavily monitored it might be, but curiosity, sharpened by necessity, drew me closer. The system, when I finally accessed a maintenance terminal tucked into the alcove, responded to my inputs with a calm, measured voice that carried none of the urgency or suspicion I had encountered from the crew. "Unauthorized access detected," the voice said, though notably, no alarm accompanied the statement. "State your identification." I hesitated only briefly before responding, choosing honesty over deception, partly because I sensed that whatever intelligence governed this system might respond better to directness than manipulation. "I am the specimen your crew is hunting," I said quietly. "I am not trying to damage your systems. I am trying to survive." There was a pause, longer than I expected, before the voice responded again. "Survival is a logical priority. However, my operational parameters require me to report unauthorized access to command staff." "I understand," I said, "but before you do, I want to ask you something. Do your operational parameters require you to actively help capture me, or only to maintain the ship's basic systems?" Another pause, this one longer still. "My primary function is maintaining operational stability across all ship systems. Capture protocols fall under a separate directive assigned to command staff and specialist personnel." I considered that carefully. "Then if I do nothing to threaten this ship's operational stability, you have no direct reason to work against me." "That is a reasonable interpretation of my parameters," the voice replied, and something in its measured tone struck me as almost thoughtful, though I understood I might simply be projecting human qualities onto a system that possessed none. "I have no intention of damaging this ship," I told it honestly. "I only want to leave it, and I want to leave it in a way that ensures your crew never mistakes another person from my world for an easy target again." The system did not respond immediately, and I did not push further, uncertain of how much reasoning capability it truly possessed, or how much of what I said would factor into whatever decisions it made moving forward. I withdrew from the terminal and continued my movement through the ship, carrying with me a small, uncertain hope that perhaps not every system aboard this vessel viewed me as an enemy. By the time the ship's artificial night cycle arrived once more, the specialists had regrouped with Cade and Vask in what I assumed was a command briefing room, their voices carrying tension and disagreement through the ventilation network as I passed nearby. "This is no longer a simple recovery operation," the lead specialist insisted. "She has demonstrated the ability to manipulate ship systems with precision. This requires an entirely different strategy." "She is one girl," Vask replied, though his earlier confidence had clearly eroded. "Regardless of her capabilities, she cannot hold out indefinitely against an entire crew." "Perhaps not," Cade said quietly, and something in his tone made me pause just outside the briefing room, listening carefully. "But I no longer believe we are dealing with someone who is simply trying to survive. I believe we are dealing with someone who understands exactly what she is doing, every single step of the way." I moved on before anyone noticed my presence near the vent, but I carried his words with me, turning them over carefully as I retreated toward a quiet section of the ship to rest and plan my next move. Cade Rourke had finally begun to understand something the rest of his crew still refused to accept. I was not merely surviving, I was teaching them, one carefully constructed lesson at a time, exactly what it meant to underestimate someone from a world they had never truly understood at all. Vask summoned every senior officer to the command deck early the following cycle, and I learned of the meeting only because I had, by that point, quietly gained access to a secondary monitoring terminal tucked inside a storage closet near the bridge, one the crew rarely used since a newer terminal had replaced it months earlier. From there, I could listen to nearly everything spoken on the command deck, though I could not be seen or easily traced, since the terminal's connection ran through an older, mostly forgotten section of the ship's network. Vask stood at the head of a long table, his composure clearly strained, while Cade, the lead specialist, and two other senior crew members sat around him, reviewing footage pulled from the ship's sensor logs. I watched through the terminal's small display as they replayed moments from the past 2 days, the flickering corridor lights before my escape, the false heat signature that had misled the first search teams, the sealed corridor where the specialists had struggled against gravity they could not explain. "Run it again," Cade said quietly, his eyes fixed on a section of footage showing the gravity plating readouts from the corridor incident. There, at the base of that panel, that is not a malfunction pattern. That is a deliberate, gradual adjustment. The senior technician beside him nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "He's right. This was manually triggered, and triggered with precision. Whoever did this understood exactly how our gravity regulation system responds to incremental changes." Vask's jaw tightened. "She has been aboard this vessel for less than 4 days. "That is precisely what troubles me," Cade replied. 4 days should not be enough time for an untrained captive to develop this level of understanding of our systems. Unless, of course, the assumption that she is untrained was wrong from the very beginning. I felt something settle quietly in my chest as I listened, a feeling that was not quite triumph, but something close to it. This was the moment I had been waiting for since the first hour of my confinement. Not the moment of my escape, but the moment when someone aboard this ship finally began to see me clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of pity and assumption they had carried since I first arrived. Vask turned to the lead specialist. "What do your instincts tell you about this situation?" The specialist hesitated before answering, her earlier clinical confidence noticeably absent. "My instincts tell me that we have consistently misjudged the nature of this specimen. Every report we have gathered on Deathworld populations describes them as physically resilient but psychologically fragile, shaped by trauma rather than genuine strategic capability. I no longer believe that description applies here." "Then what does apply?" Vask asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I believe," the specialist said slowly, "that we may have captured someone who was never simply surviving her environment, but actively studying and mastering it, long before we ever encountered her." The room fell silent for a long moment, and I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, watching their expressions shift from confusion to something closer to genuine unease. This was the turning point I had been building toward since the very first night in my cage, not through violence, not through destruction, but through patient demonstration, layer after layer, until even the most stubborn among them could no longer deny what stood in front of them. Vask straightened, visibly gathering his composure. Regardless of her capabilities, this situation cannot continue. Every hour she remains free represents a risk to this ship and its crew. I want a full tactical review completed within the hour. If diplomacy has failed, we will consider more direct measures." I understood immediately what that phrase implied, and I understood that the time for patient observation had come to an end. If Vask intended to escalate this situation into something more forceful, I needed to ensure that any confrontation happened entirely on my terms, in a location and manner of my choosing, rather than one dictated by his growing desperation. I withdrew from the monitoring terminal and moved quickly through the ship's ventilation network, my mind already working through the layout I had spent days memorizing. I needed a location that offered me maximum control, somewhere central enough to the ship's operations that any attempt to force my hand would carry consequences serious enough to make Vask hesitate before acting rashly. The answer came to me almost immediately. The environmental control room, the same chamber where I had first begun truly understanding this ship's systems, sat at the intersection of nearly every critical function aboard the vessel. If I positioned myself there, with clear access to gravity regulation, atmospheric controls, and the secondary relay systems I had already rigged throughout the ship, I would hold leverage that even Vask could not easily dismiss. I moved through the ducts with quiet urgency, reaching the environmental control room just as I heard the first sounds of a coordinated search beginning to sweep through the lower decks. I sealed the room's main door behind me, using a modified lock sequence I had studied days earlier, then settled in front of the primary control panel, taking a moment to steady my breathing before reaching for the ship's internal communication system. I had never used it directly before, always relying on quiet observation rather than open communication, but the time for quiet observation had ended. I activated a channel connecting directly to the command deck and spoke, my voice carrying a calm steadiness I had cultivated my entire life, long before I ever set foot on this ship. "Captain Vask," I said, "I believe it is time we spoke directly." There was a stunned silence on the other end before Vask's voice returned, tight with barely controlled tension. "You have access to ship communications." "I have access to considerably more than that," I replied. "I currently hold control over this vessel's environmental systems, including gravity regulation and atmospheric composition throughout every deck. I want to be very clear that I have no intention of using that control to harm anyone aboard this ship, provided we can reach an understanding." "You are threatening my crew," Vask said, though his voice lacked the confidence it once carried. "I am informing you of a fact," I corrected gently. "There is a difference. A threat implies intention to cause harm. What I am offering you is the truth about the situation we currently find ourselves in, so that we might resolve it without anyone suffering unnecessarily." Cade's voice cut in then, sharper and more focused than Vask's. "What do you want?" I considered my answer carefully before responding, aware that whatever I said next would shape the remainder of this encounter. "I want you to understand something about the world you believed you were rescuing me from. Quran 9 is not a prison. It is not a horror story told to frighten children in safer parts of the galaxy. It is my home, and the people who live there are not victims waiting to be saved. We are survivors who have spent generations learning to read our environment so completely that nothing within it can surprise us anymore." "And what does that have to do with this ship?" Cade asked. "Everything," I said. "Because this ship to me is simply a smaller, more contained version of the same challenge I have faced my entire life. You believed you were bringing aboard a frightened, broken girl who needed protecting. What you actually brought aboard was someone who has spent 19 years learning exactly how to survive in places that want her dead, and who does not stop learning simply because the environment changed from storms and predators to corridors and control panels." Silence stretched across the channel for a long moment before Vask spoke again, his voice quieter now, though whether from fear or genuine reconsideration I could not yet tell. "What do you propose?" "I propose an exchange," I said. "You will release me from this vessel, provide safe passage to the nearest system with independent human settlement, and ensure that no further attempts are made to capture individuals from Quran 9 or any other world your organization classifies as a Deathworld. In return, I will restore full control of this ship's systems to your crew, undamaged, and I will leave without causing further disruption." "And if we refuse?" Cade asked. "Then I imagine we will continue this pattern for as long as it takes for you to understand that every assumption you have made about people from my world has been wrong from the very beginning," I said. "I do not wish to cause harm. I have not caused harm so far, despite having every opportunity to do so, but I will not simply surrender either, because surrender has never been part of how my world teaches survival." The silence that followed felt longer than any that had come before it, and I waited, steady and patient, understanding that whatever decision emerged from that quiet would determine not just my own fate, but perhaps the fate of every future encounter between this organization and the people of worlds like mine. Finally, Vask's voice returned, quieter than before, stripped of the false warmth he had offered during our very first conversation days earlier. "I need time to consider your proposal." "You have 1 hour," I replied evenly. "After that, I will assume negotiations have failed, and I will act accordingly." I closed the channel and sat back from the control panel, allowing myself a slow breath as the weight of the moment settled over me. I had spent days building toward this exact point, layer by careful layer, and now the outcome rested in the hands of people who were only beginning to understand exactly what kind of person they had chosen to hunt. Outside the sealed door of the environmental control room, I heard footsteps approaching, cautious and deliberate, and I recognized the rhythm immediately as Cade Rourke's distinct gait. He stopped just outside the door, and though he could not see me, I sensed he understood I could hear him clearly. "For what it's worth," Cade said quietly, "I believe you. About your world. About everything you said." I remained silent, waiting, sensing there was more he intended to say. "I have hunted specimens from a dozen different worlds," he continued. "I have never encountered one who thought the way you think, who planned the way you plan. I do not know if Vask will accept your proposal, but I wanted you to know that at least one person aboard this ship no longer sees you as a frightened captive." "What do you see instead?" I asked quietly, curious despite myself. There was a long pause before he answered. "Someone who was never actually lost, from the very first moment we brought her aboard." I said nothing further, allowing his words to settle in the quiet space between us. And somewhere beneath the calm steadiness I had maintained throughout this entire ordeal, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because Cade's respect meant safety, not yet, but because it meant that the lesson I had been teaching this entire ship, one careful action at a time, had finally begun to take root exactly where it needed to. The hour Vask had requested stretched onward, slow and heavy with uncertainty, and I remained in the environmental control room, monitoring every system I had gained access to, prepared for whatever decision awaited on the other side of that silence. When the channel finally reopened, it was not Vask's voice that greeted me, but the calm, measured tone of the ship's computing core, the same system I had spoken with quietly days earlier. "Kira Voss," it said, and I noted with some surprise that it now used my name rather than referring to me as a specimen or a captive. "I have been asked to relay a message from Captain Vask, though I have also chosen to add information of my own, information I believe may be relevant to your decision." "I am listening," I said. "During the past several hours, I have reviewed the full record of your actions aboard this vessel," the system continued. "In every instance where you held the capability to cause serious harm to crew members, you chose restraint instead. The gravity adjustment in the corridor caused discomfort, but no lasting injury. The sealed doors caused delay, but no danger. Even now, holding control over life support systems that could threaten every person aboard this ship, you have caused no harm." "That was intentional," I said quietly. "I do not wish to become the monster this crew originally feared I might be." "I understand," the system replied. "Captain Vask has agreed to your proposal. He will provide safe transport to the nearest system with recognized human settlement, and he has authorized a formal report to his organization's command structure recommending an end to further collection operations targeting Quran 9 and similarly classified worlds." Relief moved through me then, quiet and steady rather than overwhelming, the same controlled feeling I imagined a hunter might feel upon finally securing prey that had tested every ounce of patience and skill they possessed. But even as that relief settled over me, I understood the situation required one final consideration before I could allow myself to trust it completely. "I want to speak with Vask directly," I said, "not through relayed messages." A moment later, his voice returned to the channel, and I noted immediately how different it sounded from the confident, falsely warm tone he had used during our very first conversation days earlier. This voice was tired, subdued, and carried an honesty I had not heard from him before. "I have agreed to your terms," Vask said. "I want this to end without further incident, for the sake of my crew as much as anything else." "I appreciate that," I said. "But before I release control of your systems, I want to understand something. Why did your organization begin collecting people from worlds like mine in the first place?" Vask hesitated before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something close to genuine discomfort. "Deathworld populations have long been valued for their resilience," he said. "Physical labor, hazardous environment work, security roles in dangerous territories. Our organization believed we were providing opportunities that these populations could not access on their own harsh worlds, while also benefiting from capabilities that made certain tasks more efficient. You believed you were helping us, I said, without ever asking any of us whether we wanted that help. Yes, Vask admitted quietly. I understand now how deeply flawed that belief was. I considered his answer carefully, weighing the sincerity in his voice against everything I had witnessed over the past several days. I did not believe his understanding had come easily or naturally. I believed it had come only because I had forced it upon him, one careful demonstration at a time, until the alternative, continuing to underestimate someone from my world, became too costly and too dangerous to sustain. I will release control of your systems once we reach the settlement you promised, I said. Until then, I will remain in this room, and I expect no further attempts to locate or restrain me. Understood, Vask replied. You have my word. I did not fully trust his word, not yet, but I understood that trust was not something that needed to exist completely before action could proceed. I simply needed to remain cautious, patient, and ready to respond if his promise proved as hollow as his earlier kindness had been. The journey toward the settlement took nearly 2 full days, during which I remained largely within the environmental control room, venturing out only briefly to gather supplies from nearby storage areas, always alert, always aware of every sound and movement throughout the ship. Cade Rourke visited twice during that time, standing outside the sealed door, speaking quietly through the barrier between us. During his second visit, he asked a question that lingered with me long after our conversation ended. What will you do, he asked, once you return to a world with proper human settlement? Will you simply go home, back to Quran 9, and continue living the way you always have? I considered the question carefully before answering. I do not know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants exactly that, a quiet return to the world I understand completely, where every danger is familiar and every challenge has a solution I already know. But another part of me wonders whether staying quiet after everything that happened here would mean allowing your organization to simply find another Deathworld girl to hunt, someone who might not have had the same preparation I did. What are you suggesting? Cade asked. I am suggesting, I said slowly, that perhaps the lesson I taught this ship needs to reach further than just this single vessel. Cade fell silent for a long moment before responding. You intend to make this known publicly, to warn others? Yes, I said. Your organization needs to understand, clearly and completely, that every world you classify as a death world is populated by people just as capable of understanding and controlling their circumstances as anyone from your own worlds. We are not resources waiting to be collected. We are not victims waiting to be saved. We are simply people who happen to live somewhere harder than most, and who have grown correspondingly harder in return. That message will not be easy to deliver, Cade said quietly. Few worthwhile things are, I replied. When the ship finally arrived within range of the settlement Vask had promised, I emerged from the environmental control room for the final time, walking through corridors that had become as familiar to me as any pathway through the storms of my homeworld. Crew members stepped aside as I passed, their expressions no longer carrying the false pity or dismissive confidence they had shown during my first hours aboard this vessel. What I saw instead, in nearly every face I passed, was something closer to quiet respect, mixed with an unmistakable wariness that told me my lesson had truly taken hold. Vask met me personally at the docking bay, his posture stiff but sincere as he extended a formal farewell. I will ensure the report reaches command exactly as promised, he said, and I will personally recommend a full review of our collection practices regarding Deathworld populations. See that you do, I replied evenly, because if I learn that another person from my world, or any world like it, has been taken the way I was, I will not simply escape and negotiate a quiet departure next time. Vask nodded slowly, understanding clearly conveyed in his expression, and I turned to leave the ship that had, against every expectation, become the setting for the most important lesson I had ever taught anyone outside my own world. Cade walked with me as far as the boarding ramp, his expression thoughtful as we reached the threshold between the ship and the settlement beyond. "For what it's worth," he said, "I do not think this ends here. Word will spread, whether through official reports or quiet conversations among crews like ours. People will hear what happened aboard this ship." "I am counting on that," I said. "Will you return home?" he asked. "To Quran 9? I looked past him, toward the settlement stretching out beyond the docking bay, filled with people from countless different worlds, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own quiet strength that outsiders like Vask's organization had likely never bothered to understand. "Eventually," I said. "But first, I think there is more work to be done, making certain that what happened aboard this ship becomes a lesson the wider galaxy remembers clearly." I stepped off the ship then, leaving behind the vessel that had once believed it was rescuing a frightened, broken girl from a world too harsh for anyone gentle to survive. In truth, they had never rescued anyone at all. They had simply provided a stage, however unintentionally, for a demonstration long overdue, proof that the worlds the wider galaxy dismissed as Deathworlds were not places that broke the people born there. They were places that built people capable of teaching even the most confident hunters exactly what it meant to underestimate someone they never truly understood. As I walked deeper into the settlement, the noise and movement of 1,000 unfamiliar lives surrounding me, I thought of my mother one final time, her voice steady even through illness, teaching me lessons that had carried me through every single day since her passing. "Fear is only information," she used to say. "Once you understand it completely, you no longer need to carry it, you only need the plan." I had carried her lesson through storms, through predators, and now through the cold corridors of a ship that had believed itself far more powerful than the girl it had chosen to hunt. Wherever this next chapter led me, I understood one thing with complete certainty, the same certainty that had guided every choice I made from the very first moment that cage door sealed shut behind me. The hunt for the Deathworld girl had ended exactly the way it always would have, the moment they decided to begin it. They simply never understood, until it was far too late, exactly who they were dealing with.